Yeah, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
My name is Tamer Osman, and I'm gonna be the chair for this session. Would like to start at the first section with the presentation from Hironoro, Hironoroi
Yeah, here in
Katasuda, and I'm sorry for the mispronunciation. University of California, Los Angeles, and Jeremy Steffman from University of California, Los Angeles as well. Could you start, please?
Yeah, I will share my screen.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay.
And please make sure about time.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, yes, that's very, very important, the time.
Okay, good morning, everyone. The title of our presentation is The Role of Segment and Pitch Accent in Japanese Spoken Word Recognition. Let me start with some background. Spoken word recognition is generally assumed to involve two phases, lexical activation and lexical competition. Lexical activation is a process in which listeners evoke multiple candidates that are consistent with the incoming speech, while in lexical competition, those activated candidates compete for recognition. It is well established that both segmental and suprasegmental properties, such as stress, tone, pitch accent, are important for lexical activation. However, the role of suprasegmental properties differs across languages, heavily depending on how informative it is to identify words in the language. To see this, let's first contrast English and Spanish. English is a stress language in which stress usually correlates with vowel quality, such as object and object. Here, capital letters indicate stressed syllables, and crucially, unstressed syllables are reduced to schwa, so this is why stress correlates with vowel quality. Therefore, minimal stress pairs that do not differ in vowel quality, such as forbear and forbear, are very rare. Cutler conducted a cross-modal priming study and revealed that listening to forbear with the stress on the first syllable primes both forbear, the same word, and forbear, the other member of the minimal stress pair. And this means that listeners are treating both words as identical, at least in the stage of word activation. In other words, stress is not used to restrict word activation. The situation is different in Spanish, which is also a stress language, but in Spanish, stress does not correlate with vowel quality. Soto-Ferso et al. Conducted a series of experiments, and in their first experiment 1, they revealed that when primes and targets are matched segmentally but mismatched in terms of stress, they observed an inhibitory effect of the lexical decision of the target. For example, listening to a word fragment princy with the stress on the second syllable does not prime and actually inhibit the target of the target principe, which matches the prime in terms of segment, but mismatch the suprasegmental structure, namely the stress location is mismatched. And this means that stress is used to restrict word activation in Spanish. Recently, relative contributions of segmental and suprasegmental properties have been explored in several different languages. First, experiment 2 of the same Spanish study revealed that when primes and targets are matched in terms of stress location, but mismatched segmentally. Notice this is the opposite of experiment 1, and they also observe an inhibitory effect. So for example, listening to a word fragment, abun does not prime the target, abandono, which matches the prime in terms of stress location, but mismatches the prime in segment. Since they observed comparable inhibitory effects in both experiment 1 and 2, they conclude that stress and segment are equally used to restrict word activation. On the other hand, in Mandarin Chinese, which is a lexical tone language with 4 distinct tones, Sereno and Lee conducted an auditory priming study, and they contrasted the following 2 conditions. In the first condition, primes and targets are matched segmentally but mismatched tonally. And in this condition, they observed a facilitatory effect of the lexical decision of the target. While in the other condition, in which primes and targets are matched tonally, but mismatched segmentally, they observed an inhibitory effect. And based on these results, the authors concluded that segment plays more important role in restricting word activation. So this is different from the Spanish case. Finally, the role of pitch accent has been relatively understudied, and we can now look at one study about Japanese. Japanese is a lexical pitch accent language with 3 accent patterns possible for disyllables, such as initially accented hashi, finally accented hashi, and unaccented hashi. Cutler and Otake conducted auditory priming task, and they found that when primes and targets are matched segmentally, but mismatched in terms of pitch accent, they didn't observe any facilitatory effect. So for example, listening to initially accented hashi does not prime finally accented hashi. And this clearly suggests that pitch accent is used to restrict word activation, like like Spanish and Mandarin Chinese cases. However, there are some potential issues of the experimental design of their study. First, they didn't distinguish between finally accented words and unaccented words. This is because those types of words are prosodically neutralized in isolation, and both are pronounced with a low-high pitch pattern in isolation, which is the phonetic realization of those words.
Hironori, please give time for Jeremy to speak because there's no time. Okay.
Oh, really?
So must make it quick because Jeremy has to speak. Yes.
So I was hi, I'm Jeremy. I was going to take over in a couple minutes. We thought we had until 11.
Okay.
Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you have like 7 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Okay. We had until 11:20 to finish.
No, I have to. No, for the 4 sessions that I have, it will be by 11.
Oh. Okay.
Okay, that's for me. And Taylor Jones will take after me. So that's why I have to make sure that the 4 sections here until 11 they are to be finished. So that's why you have to take care of time. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Okay, so we need 7 minutes.
Okay.
So can I just?
So will you proceed? Okay, you have to make sure because time is running. I'm sorry about it.
Okay, yeah, I mean, okay, so
you give 7 minutes to Jeremy or what?
So I think Hiro's going to talk for a little bit, then I'm going to talk for a little bit, then he'll conclude. But
we'll no, little bit minutes. How many minutes? That's the point.
We can try to be done, both of us, within 7 minutes.
Because still we have, I have a lot of people, they have to talk in this session. So you cannot go on and on. So
we practice a lot and we made sure we can finish in 20 minutes.
There is no 20 minutes. There's 7 minutes left for you. And afterwards, I have to go to the next.
Okay.
Yes?
Okay, we'll try to go very fast.
Okay. Go ahead.
So yeah, the second issue is they didn't have accent match and segment mismatch condition. And this is why they couldn't compare the role of segment and accent directly. And also they didn't match word frequencies. And we think this is a concern, so we will take care of this in our experimental design. And yeah, so we will basically replicate and extend Cutler and Otake's original study in a more comprehensive experimental design, and which allows us to directly compare the role of segment and pitch accent in word recognition. We conducted auditory lexical addition task with dice levels, and we have these 3 conditions: identity condition, segment condition, and crucially, we had accent match condition, and also a control condition. And we distinguished 3 accent types: initially accented words, and finally accented words, and unaccented words. And to distinguish these accent patterns, we used frame sentence. Yeah, Jeremy.
Great. Okay, I will take over, and for the sake of brevity, we'll be very quick for our design. We just had half words, half non-word targets, a total of 96 trials with counterbalanced lists, and our stimuli were recorded by a native. Tokyo Japanese speaker. And a trial itself consisted of the prime followed by 250 millisecond ISI, then the target, then the decision response. We recruited 42 people in total. However, because of COVID, mid-recruitment, we moved our study online. Therefore, about half of the people were tested in person and half the people over the internet. And we'd be happy to talk about differences between these, or looking at results split by these settings later, but we'll present combined results here. So we basically used a mixed effects regression model to assess the data. Again, for the sake of time, I won't go into details about the structure, but feel free to ask later. Let's consider briefly some predictions about how we could diagnose the role of accent in restricting activation. If segment and identity primes are comparable, this would suggest that accent is restricting activation. That is essentially listeners treat a segment prime as an identity prime, even with mismatching accent. On the other hand, if reaction time is greater for segment than identity primes, this would suggest a lack of accent matching is detrimental. Secondly, as you can see at bottom, we can consider the relative contributions of both segment and accent. If segment and accent primes show a similar influence in terms of reaction time and accuracy, we can conclude that they are being processed comparably in line with finding Spanish stress. On the other hand, if they differ, we can conclude they're exerting a different role in recognition. So turning to the results, for the sake of time, again, I will just present our reaction time results, but we can discuss our accuracy results during the question period. Here you see reaction time split by prime type labeled below the plot. Let's first consider the difference between segment and identity primes. Here we can see overall the two rightmost bars, there's a difference whereby the segment primes are substantially slower than identity primes, which is shown by the model estimate at top. Now, in this next slide, we can see the posterior distribution for the estimated effect from the model comparing these two prime types. The dashed line is given at 0, representing an estimated no difference between the two primes. So what we see is the bulk of the posterior distribution is at negative 0.2. That is an estimated negative 0.2 log transformed millisecond difference for identity as compared to segment primes. So what this tells us is the model is quite sure there's a difference between these prime types. And thus we can say, in terms of our predictions, this suggests clearly that accent is being used to restrict activation. Otherwise, we should see these two prime types as being the same. Moreover, the model finds no reliable difference between segment and control primes, as you see here. And finally, we can compare accent primes to segment primes explicitly. The difference between these two prime types is not as reliable as the difference we saw between segment and identity primes. However, with the Bayesian analysis, we're in kind of a position to quantify our certainty about this effect, which you can see again in the posterior distribution, where you can see the bulk of the estimate is a positive non-zero value. That is, the model is fairly certain. We can say about 93 or 94% certain that the accent primes show increased log reaction times relative to segment primes, as you see additionally in the bar plot. So this does not definitively suggest a difference between these two conditions. However, given this because there's a non-trivial portion of the distribution that's showing an opposite directionality. So like I said, for brevity, I'll skip our accuracy results, but they essentially confirmed what we saw in terms of reaction time. We'd be happy to discuss them in more detail during question time. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Hira.
Okay, so regarding the role of accent, we found the facilitation effect in the identity condition, but we didn't find any facilitation in the segment condition. So this basically means accent is used to restrict word activation, replicating Kaplan and Otake's original study. And with respect to the relative contributions of segment and accent, the results are not as clear as the role of accent. However, we found some moderately strong evidence of the difference between segment and accent conditions. However, we didn't find any difference between segment and control condition. This suggests that the difference between segment and accent condition is due to the inhibition effect in the accent condition, and which is also consistent with the accuracy data. Now, why inhibition?
Okay, time.
Really?
Time. Yes. So we have one question for you, and when if there are any more questions, they can send you emails for clarifications or inquiries. So I'll ask the question here. Did you also control for the semantic relatedness between primes and targets I expect competition between semantic priming and suprasegmental priming. Also, do you think we can consider employing nonce words to avoid such confound?
Yeah, we did that. Yeah, we control semantic relationships. Basically, we chose semantically unrelated primes and target. And also we use nonce words for, of course, yeah, we included, nonce words in our experiment because that's lexical addition task and half of the words are nonce words, yeah.
I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Hironori. We'll come to the second presentation. Okay. Lila Cursett and Judith Deegan from Stanford University. Yes, hi.
Sharing my screen. So do I have 15 minutes or 20 minutes for the talk? I thought it was 20.
Oh, as far as I have to be chairing until 11. And as far as I know that I have more 2 sections. So you should be doing this in 15 minutes. If anybody have any questions, they can contact you by email.
Sure. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, yes. Okay. Go ahead, please.
So this talk is about the role of perceptual difficulty in predicting the asymmetry in use of over-informative referring expressions. So imagine having to describe the object that's marked by the green border to a person who sees the same objects in a different order. What would you say? It turns out that a lot of people say the brown chair, even though saying chair is sufficient for unique reference. People often include redundant adjectives in their utterances. And this redundant use of adjectives is also commonly referred to as over-informativeness or over-modification. And there are systematic differences in these over-modification patterns observed for different types of adjectives like size, color, and material adjectives. So when size is sufficient for unique reference, speakers commonly include color adjectives. So in a context like this, to refer to this chair in the middle, a speaker could say the big chair, but they often call it the big brown chair. And the same is not true for size. And here's a context where it's sufficient to mention the color to reference the object in the middle. And in contexts like this, speakers don't tend to mention size redundantly. They would just call this the brown chair and not the big brown chair. And we also see this asymmetry with color and material adjectives. People rarely mention material adjectives in non-contrastive contexts, but they produce color adjectives in such contexts. So why do people use redundant adjectives? There are many explanations offered in the literature for the source of redundant adjective use, including pragmatic, semantic, lexical, and visual ones. It's been shown that typicality of the property for the object is an important factor. It's been argued that highly predictable properties of objects are not encoded as part of their default descriptions, so their use triggers a contrastive function. Redundant adjective use has also been shown to depend on the lexical category of the noun and also to the semantics of the adjective, more specifically the inherent relativity of scalar adjectives. And recent work also shows that a word order is a predictor of differences in cross-linguistic redundant adjective use. Then there are also visual accounts of over-modification that focus on the role of perceptual factors. And these argue that redundant adjective use is sensitive to relative visual salience of properties that adjectives denote. And this is the idea that we're testing here. We're testing the role of perceptual difficulty in the production of redundant adjectives in referring expressions. And the prediction is that the more difficult it is to judge whether an object has a feature, the less likely speakers are to redundantly mention that feature. And we're testing this in the domain of color and material adjectives. And this prediction is also consistent with recent computational models of referring expression production. And I will come back to this at the end. But very briefly, the model that's proposed by Deegan et al. Assumes that some adjectives are inherently more informative or more noisy for the purpose of establishing reference. And thinking about perceptual difficulty as the contributor to this adjectival noise provides a pragmatic explanation for how systematically related perceptual factors are to informativity calculations. And this is just to give you a conceptual framework to think about this. So we ran 3 experiments, and in the first one, we normed the perceptual difficulty associated with establishing whether an object exhibits a color or material, and we select objects with highest and lowest perceptual difficulty to test in the second experiment. In the second experiment, we tested an interactive reference game whether adjectives that denote more perceptually difficult properties are indeed less frequently produced redundantly. And then finally, in experiment 3, we investigate the role of perceptual difficulty beyond property type, and we replicate the perceptual difficulty measures from the first experiment. So we had 12 objects, and each object occurred in 2 or 3 different materials and in 3 different colors, and the resulting 81 images were normed. And in this first experiment, we showed participants pictures of these objects and adjectives, and we asked them to indicate whether the object had the property denoted by the adjective or not by pressing a key as quickly as possible. And every participant saw each image once. We collected 30 judgments for each image with correct and incorrect color and material. So here on the left, we have the proportion of correct responses to color and material adjectives. And on the right, we have the mean response time to color and material adjectives. The individual dots are the by item means. So overall, material words resulted in higher error rates and greater response times than color words. So to test this hypothesis, we extracted high and low difficulty items from the set of normed items. We generated these groups in multiple different ways based on error rates and response times, and we looked at their overlap. And finally, we grouped 8 image color adjective pairs into a low difficulty group and 8 image material adjective pairs into a high difficulty group. So in the low difficulty group, we had images of these objects with colors that were the easiest to perceive. And in the high difficulty group, we had images of objects in materials that were the most difficult to perceive. Experiment 2 was this interactive reference game, and our goal was to elicit production probabilities of redundantly mentioning color and material adjectives for the high and low difficulty items that were normed in the first experiment. And in this reference game, participants were randomly assigned to speaker and listener roles, and the speaker used a chat box to communicate the target object to the listener, who in turn selected this object. And on critical trials, participants saw a display with 4 objects of the same type, in which either color or material was redundant to distinguish the target, and it was marked by a green border in the speaker's display. So I'll walk you through this example. This is a low difficulty color redundant trial, and we're seeing the speaker's display. And the target is the green plastic bottle. It's the only plastic bottle, so mentioning the material is sufficient, and calling it the plastic bottle. There's one more green bottle here, and this makes mentioning the color redundant. And also this target item is specifically chosen because in experiment 1, we saw that this particular bottle is in a color that's very easy to perceive. So we had 8 low difficulty and 8 high difficulty trials. And these trials are named according to the redundant property of the target object. And on low difficulty trials, mentioning color was redundant because color is a low difficulty feature. And on high difficulty trials, material was redundant because it's the high difficulty feature. And we always had 3 distractor objects in the array, and one of them shared the redundant feature with the target. So to explore the use of redundant adjectives, we first classified these produced utterances as color and material, only color, or only material. And here we see the proportion of non-redundant only material utterances on the right. These utterances were sufficient when they were uttered in the low difficulty trials, and they were underinformative in the high difficulty trials. For example, calling this green metal chair, the metal chair is underinformative because there's another metal chair here, the purple one. And in the middle, we have the proportion of non-redundant only color utterances, and they were used more in the high difficulty trials because in these trials, mentioning the color was sufficient. And finally, we have the color and material utterances on the left, and these are utterances in which people used redundant adjectives. And we see that speakers were more likely to redundantly mention color than material. And I think overall it's interesting how much speakers just avoided mentioning the material. So in the second step, we manually checked for the use of modifiers other than color and material adjectives. And we found that on 40% of all utterances, participants used a modifier of a different kind to reference the target. And these modifiers included shape, size, shade, and type modifiers. For example, they said the shiny picture instead of the metal picture, or the solar cup instead of the plastic cup. And the full data pattern with color, material, and these manually checked modifiers revealed that when material was the redundant feature, participants only mentioned the color. And when color was the redundant feature, they either produced color and material utterances or they over-modified with color and used the modifier denoting a property other than color or material. So participants strongly dispreferred mentioning material. So far, we replicated the previously observed asymmetry between over-modification with color and material adjectives on this new set of items. And given the norms from the first experiment, this suggests that the more difficult it is to judge whether an object has a feature, the less likely speakers are to redundantly mention that feature. However, these results do not reflect perceptual difficulty differences beyond the property type. The items in the study were specifically selected for maximal perceptual difficulty difference between color and material. But the overall effect sizes in the first experiment was relatively small. And we want to test a stronger version of this perceptual difficulty hypothesis. And we want to show that it predicts redundant adjective mention even within property. So an easier to perceive material should be mentioned redundantly more frequently than a harder to perceive material. And the issue here is that the small effect sizes from the first experiment mean that there's not much within property variability in perceptual difficulty that can be used for testing the hypothesis within property. So we ran a third study to remedy part of this problem by obtaining perceptual difficulty estimates for the same items with a more sensitive perceptual difficulty measure that's likely to yield greater within property variability. And we also wanted to see if we could replicate the results of the first experiment on the second measure. So experiment 3 was identical to experiment 1, but instead of seeing these images in isolation, participants saw the displays from the production experiment, the reference game. And these displays appeared with short descriptions, and they included a number and either a color or material adjective. And participants were asked to press a button as quickly as possible to indicate whether the display contained the objects or not. And we got judgments for the same context with 2 color and 2 material adjectives with correct and incorrect numbers. And here are the same plots that I showed you for the first experiment. On the left, we have the proportion of correct responses, and on the right, we have the mean response times, and individual dots are the by item means. So to address the first question of interest, whether material is more perceptually difficult in color, we see here that color adjectives had lower error rates, and they were faster than the responses to material adjectives. And what we have here is a density plot of the log transformed response times to redundant properties of the target items of the production experiment. And to address the strong perceptual difficulty hypothesis that perceptual difficulty modulates redundancy above and beyond property type, we ran mixed effects regression models again, and we replicated the effect of property type on response time, but we didn't find an effect of perceptual difficulty on redundant adjective use. So this analysis suggests that there's no evidence for within property effects of perceptual difficulty. And you see here the lack of overlap of the two distributions in terms of perceptual difficulty. So trial type, the property type explains the difference in redundancy with no added explanatory power from perceptual difficulty. So to sum up, we provide evidence for the weak version of the hypothesis that the propensity to redundantly use color and material adjectives may be driven by the asymmetry and the perceptual difficulty involved in establishing whether or not a particular object is of a particular color or material. And experiment 1 and 3 both provide support for this hypothesis, since in both experiments, color adjectives generally resulted in lower error rates and lower response times than materials. The analysis of the data set we collected so far doesn't provide evidence for the effect of perceptual difficulty beyond property type. And one avenue of future work is to more explicitly test the strong version of the hypothesis. The items we selected were structured such that there wasn't very much within property variability, material being more difficult to assess than color categorically, and a stronger test would specifically select for more within property perceptual difficulty variability. And coming back to this analytical framework, I can tell you more about this framework in the questions section, maybe. And then we just want to say that we're neutral in regards to whether redundant use of adjectives is a speaker internal or listener oriented process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lila. Okay, there is a question here for you from Gregory. It says, why shouldn't we interpret your results as support for the visual salience hypothesis?
Right. I mean, sure, it's possible that other factors here are involved, but that's why the follow-ups are important, testing items with more within property variability. But I think the fact that we found we replicated this asymmetry twice, and how material was more perceptually difficult than color in both experiments, and how it was used less frequently redundantly, I think it at least shows that property type that's more perceptually difficult is produced less redundantly.
Okay. No more questions until now. We can just wait 1 minute. Maybe somebody would ask. Okay, as far as I can see, there are no more questions. May I ask if Judith is presenting with you or
No.
Judith? No? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll go to the next presenters in our session. We have Jeremy Needle, University of Toronto, Simon Todd, University of California, Janet King, University of Canterbury, Jennifer Hay from University of Canterbury. Yes?
Thank you. I'm just having a little trouble.
Yes, okay, Jeremy.
All right, are you seeing my slides?
Yes. Could you please
Thank you.
introduce yourself to us and then you can start, please.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, hello, I'm Jeremy Needle. The rest of my co-authors are not presenting with this today, but I appreciate having you. Talking on Maori. The question I'm
Jeremy,
looking at here is
okay, the sound quality is not good. So can you fix it, please?
That seems unlikely.
Okay, now we can hear you well.
We're interested in how people do reduplication. How do they recognize and process these words? Questions of variation and psycholinguistic mechanisms of reduplication still remain after a lot of previous work here. To answer these questions, we're looking to behavioral data of fluent speakers. We investigate reduplication in Te Reo Maori, the indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reduplication is prevalent in Maori, present in 22% of word types. Published grammars describe a small number of simple phonological templates for reduplication, and we focus on the 4 major templates today. First, there is full reduplication, like katakata. Full reduplication is treated as a left side process, and these glosses are example meanings for some polysemous terms. Left reduplication involves a partial left side copy, like nunui, which may have vowel lengthening, like kakao. And right reduplication, on the other hand, involves a partial right side copy, like in korerorero. This table shows the prevalence of these templates in our data. Full reduplication is the most prevalent, then right and left, and you can see that left reduplication with vowel lengthening is the rarest. We ask in this study, to what extent are native speakers aware of reduplication in complex words? And to what extent do their representations of reduplication resemble those identified in these formal grammars? Just a quick roadmap. I'm going to describe the elicitation task that we used, and then show you the broad rates of agreement between the speakers and the published grammars. I'll touch on some of the effects in our mixed effects regression model, and then some concluding thoughts. So our data includes morphological segmentations from 2 fluent speakers of Maori for about 10,000 word stems. Our elicitation approach extends on similar work, which is focused on non-words or very small stimuli sets in other languages. So raters are asked to mark where each word would be divided into meaningful parts for most speakers. So we're trying not to get into teaching them morphology or semantics, but still get them to sort of tap into avoiding a purely surface level segmentation. They responded to multiple lists of about 1,000 words at a time over multiple sessions, and they placed a full stop character at the location of a split, and they had the option to mark a word as unfamiliar, which, while very rare, allowed us to set those words aside. So this table shows the overall agreement of the speakers with the expectations that we had. Speakers tend to agree with the published grammars and with each other for full reduplication and for left reduplication with vowel lengthening. So you can note the macron long vowel Q there. The rate for plain left reduplication is much lower, especially for speaker 2. And basically neither speaker gives right reduplication responses at all. Instead, they seem to treat right reduplication as a case of full reduplication with some prefix. The logistics mixed effects regression predicts splits for each syllable boundary in every stem and includes terms for the speaker, the word frequency based on our corpora, and a group of terms capturing phonological structure and a group of terms that are related to the reduplication template. So the formula looks like this. It also includes random effects for sort of local splitting, and all the other terms are interacting with the speaker. So the blue terms are sort of the phonological ones, and the red terms are the templatic effects. All the effects I'm going to show you are significant, but I'm not going to display the model outputs unless someone asks later. With these general effects, you can see that Rater 1 has a higher overall rate of segmentation. And they both show a small effect of word frequency, which is probably localized on those extremely rare words, but again, not words that they labeled unfamiliar. We'll also see some of these phonological factors. Both raters tend to separate identical vowels, like a sequence of two ah. Within a morpheme in contemporary Maori, two ah would be written as ah with a macron, which is called a toto. This sequence can, however, occur at morpheme boundaries, so it likely provides a boundary cue. Raters also avoid splitting a two-vowel sequence when that sequence could be a valid diphthong. So these are the 8 possible diphthong orthographies. Both raters also tend to split after a long vowel syllable, as in kakahu. And I really have to apologize for my pronunciation, but that's roughly what we're looking at. Note here that the long vowel syllable satisfies what is likely a minimality pattern. So several prefixes have this consonant long vowel pattern. And both raters show positive, although somewhat different, tendencies to place a split increasingly as the number of vowels since their last split goes up. So we can note here that long morphemes are pretty rare, so this makes sense. And we turn now to some templatic factors. Our question again is there evidence that the speakers are responding to something beyond the phonological constraints? And we think this answer is yes. First, speakers are more likely to split at the edges of bases and at the edges of reduplicants after controlling for phonological and other factors. And I'm showing you here 2 further examples of these factors. This plot shows that both speakers strongly avoid splitting inside a reduplicant. For example, in the reduplicated word pao pao, they do not split after the first syllable. They also, which would be again, you can see here in green, that is the reduplicant part of the base of this left side. They also avoid similar splits inside the bases, although we'll see that a major exception to this is those right reduplication items. And here we can see that the raters differ in their treatment of reduplicants and their bases. Rater 1 strongly tends to separate these parts. So they would produce a parse like pao pao with a dot in the middle, while Rater 2 really often wants to keep the reduplicant together with the base as a single kind of a morphological unit. So speakers produce morphological parses that reflect their knowledge of reduplication. They do this to a lesser extent than expected based on the published grammar templates, about 53%. They do, however, agree on which templates, even if they have different overall rates. And there's structure in this inter-speaker variation. Speaker 2, for example, is less likely to separate the reduplicant from the base, as in this harakaokoa. And you can see there in blue that they want to keep those 2 parts together. Beyond these quantitative differences, we can find 2 major qualitative gaps. The speakers frequently ignore partial left reduplication, even though it's very common, and they almost never produce the expected right reduplication, which is equally common. We suggest that the left reduplication gap reflects a low salience for those short reduplicant parts when the tohatu is absent. So in the example of kukume, that little ku part has no long vowel, it doesn't have that many moras, and it's visually quite small. When there is a long vowel, as in kakau, the speakers match the expectation of the published grammars much more often, even though these forms are quite rare by comparison. We think that the right reduplication gap, as I mentioned, reflects a surprising reanalysis of the template, where speakers coerce it into a full reduplication with some kind of a prefix, even when the prefix doesn't exist, as far as we can tell. And in every case, this is produced inside a base. So for example, korerorero is analyzed as some prefix ko plus a fully reduplicated rerorero. This example is a pretty common word. Korero means talk, I think. So it is a strange thing that they're doing here, but it means that the overall pattern of responses is best captured if we assume that speakers are not using a right reduplication template at all. Together, these results suggest that speakers are avoiding complex partial reduplication templates in favor of the very simple and common full reduplication template. And this is in line with observations that full reduplication is easy and helpful. For example, facilitating word learning in younger children. And to conclude, we say that speakers of Te Reo Maori have cognitive representations for reduplication, which differ from those assumed in published grammars and which vary between speakers. And this leaves us with a variety of exciting questions in a couple of different areas. One of them is, do responses to the segmentation task reflect overt awareness or tacit knowledge? And then we also can ask, how are speakers' representations jointly influenced by phonology and semantics? And finally, to what extent should language revitalization work be sensitive to this variation we're seeing between these individuals? All right, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Who's going to make a presentation after you, Simon Todd?
No, that's it. I went a little fast to make sure that we would have plenty of time for everyone.
Okay. So here I don't have a questions for you until now, but we will wait so that if anybody would be interested in asking you a question.
Okay, well, in the meantime, I could go to some of the stuff I saved out.
Yes, please. Okay, thank you.
So here's just the Elmer summary table that goes along with some of the effects I showed. These are the sort of basic effects, and these are the phonological ones. Not all of them were part of the presentation. And then these are templatic ones. And every one of these is interacted with rater. So rater with frequency, rater with phonological effects, and rater with templatic effects. So we can see everything we talked about is significant. We tried to come at everything from several angles, even though I didn't display all of, for example, the templatic effects. The model was fit through a process where we started with possibly correlated effects, but keeping every angle available. We took out the ones that were mechanically problematic if we had to, but mostly we're relying on the model to sort of divvy the difference between these.
Okay, Jeremy, we have a question from Katie Russell. She says, do you have any information on the meta-linguistic knowledge these speakers had? For example, had they taken Maori classes or anything like that?
So these are fluent speakers. They are college students, young people, or 20s, I believe. They may have different levels of facility. We didn't include that in the modeling, but they are neither of them is like a non-fluent speaker or monolingual.
Okay, thank you for your answer. There is another question from Yuka Tatusumi. She says, could you talk a little bit more about the background of the two participants? Do they have similar background in terms of language education or language used at home?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. I don't have that data on hand.
Jeremy, the sound quality is not clear. Could you please repeat the answer once again?
Thank you. I don't have that data on hand, and obviously we're limited by the use of only 2 speakers so far. It's actually very difficult to obtain all this data. My understanding is that the 2 informants are broadly similar and from similar community, but we would love to have more people with which we could incorporate some of that variable background information. So thank you.
No more questions. We'll wait 1 more minute. Maybe somebody might ask you a question.
Mm-hmm. I should mention that I can pass along some of these questions via email to some of my other collaborators who have different kinds of specialized knowledge. So Jeanette King is particularly involved in the selection and understanding of the community informants. Simon Todd.
I see. I'm going to mention in the chat box that you mentioned your email. Yes, in the slides. So I mentioned, so if anybody would have a question for you or one of your researchers, you might be asked by email.
Thank you. Let me just finish that sentence real quick. Simon Todd is particularly the source for questions about how we operationalized the expected templatic parses using a version of Morfessor, and Jen Hay is the supervisor in general of the project. So I'm happy to pass along questions to whoever will be, the most amenable to them. Thank you. Oh yes, I see a question from Sarah Finley.
Yeah, okay.
We are still. I can read it if you don't mind.
Okay, no, I will read it. Sarah Finley, do you have intentions to run more participants to find more about how the variation is representative of others?
Yes, so the search for participants is ongoing. It's been over end to end probably a year so far. So we're gathering more data. We'd like to have at least 3 to 8 people, I imagine. It's a lot of work for them to get through all the words, and we wanted to have a sort of deep, narrow thing, but more than 2. So we fully intend to get some more speakers involved eventually. There's of course regional variation inside Aotearoa, and it's we expect to find additional interspeaker variation as we get more people.
Thank you for your answer. I have no more questions, and I already mentioned in the chat box that if anybody is interested in elaborate content about your presentation, he or she might contact you by email. That will be found at the PowerPoint slides.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so already your email is mentioned in the chat box. Okay, we'll go to the next presentation in our session today. Annalise Kendrick, and Catherine Schuler, University of Pennsylvania. I'm sorry for pronunciation. Annalise.
It's Annalise,
Yes.
just like you're renting an apartment and you're on a lease.
Annalise. Okay, Annalise. Okay, because I'm not sure about the pronunciation. I'm sorry. So could you please start?
Yes. So my name's Annalise Kendrick, as I said, and I'm an undergraduate at Eckerd College, but I work as a research assistant for Dr. Katie Schuler in the Child Language Lab at Penn. And I'll be giving the whole presentation today, and I'll be telling you about our work on regularizing unpredictable variation and the influence of learning from an unreliable speaker on this behavior. A well-known finding in child language acquisition is that when children's input contains unpredictable variation, they regularize it. For example, when learning a Pidgin or Creole language, when learning a language from late learners, and also experiments with natural and artificial language show regularization as well. However, an equally well-known finding in developmental sociolinguistics is that children can learn and match the sociolinguistic variation in their input from a very young age. For example, lots of work has shown they've mastered the constraints on TD deletion from an early age, and these kind of results have been shown in other languages as well, such as final explanation in Spanish. So the takeaway is that children can learn and match the variation in their dialect. The big question our lab is interested in is, why do children sometimes regularize variation and other times learn it? Or another way of asking this is, what leads children to treat some variation as noise and other variation as important aspects of their dialect that should be learned and matched? The literature on sociolinguistics focuses on input where variation in the community is shared, the conditioning environment is predictable, and speaker fluency is more likely. However, the literature on regularization focuses on input where variation in the community is noisy, the conditioning environment isn't predictable, and speaker fluency is less likely. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the work we've been doing on speaker fluency. Children are known to regularize Pidgin and Creole languages and when learning from non-native speakers of sign language. In both situations, input is produced by non-native speakers who may provide subtle linguistic cues to indicate their unreliable language models. Children may be more likely to assume variation is noise or mistakes by the speaker rather than an important feature of their dialect. There is at least some evidence that adults will regularize more when they think variation is noisy. Perfors argued that adults match probabilities because they assume variation is predictable. When this assumption is challenged, or when participants are told that language input might contain mistakes, Perfors found that adults do regularize. They argue that these results explain why children regularize unpredictable variation in natural language. In Perfors' study, participants were simply told to learn labels for various objects in a new language, but in one condition, they were told that the labels came from a previous participant who had a limited amount of time to provide the labels, and thus may have made some mistakes. Then within each of these conditions, there were two other conditions. One in which infrequent variation in affixes looked to be a typo, and one in which they did not. The results showed that participants that were told the linguistic data came from another participant regularized significantly more than those who believed the data came from the experimenter. This was especially true when the input looked like it could contain typos. Perfors' study is limited, though, to circumstances where adults are led to believe mistakes in the input are simply typos. So we wanted to see if an assumption that someone has made typos will translate to learners' ability to capitalize on even more subtle cues and change their rule learning. In our first experiment, we wanted to ask whether the Perfors results would extend to more complex rule learning. So we started by replicating that study. Instead of learning labels in terms of stems and affixes, where the affixes were variable like Perfors did, our participants learned full sentences and a plural marking rule where the plural marker was variable. In the Perfors study, participants learned labels for 10 common objects. And in our study, participants learned plural marking rule via six different farm animals and pictures of them. We ran 134 participants online via Prolific, which is kind of like Mechanical Turk. And participants were randomly assigned to one of two instructions conditions and one of two marker conditions, just as in the Perfors study. And I'll describe the details of those in a moment. The experiment proceeded in 3 phases: the instructions, exposure to the language, and a production test. During the instructions, participants saw different instructions depending on what condition they were in, sorry. So in the experimenter condition, the instructions indicated the sentence would be delivered by us, the experimenters. It just said, we are studying how people learn new languages. In this experiment, you will see pictures of farm animals paired with sentences describing them in Octarian. In the participant condition, we alter these to say, we are studying how people learn new languages when they are given sentences from other people. In this experiment, you will see pictures of farm animals paired with sentences describing them in Octarian. The sentences actually come from a previous participant who had to learn Octarian themselves. Some participants were given a very limited time to provide descriptions, so there might be errors. During exposure, participants saw 10 singular and 20 plural pictures for each of the 6 nouns. Each picture was paired with the corresponding sentence. Singular sentence had the verb gentive, meaning there is are, followed by a noun. Plural sentences had a verb, noun, and a plural marker. Which plural marker they were given depended on the language condition the participant was in. So in the distinct condition, each of the 5 possible markers were distinct in that they didn't resemble each other or typos. The marker in bold, ka, is the dominant marker, which is heard in 60% of plural trials. And the other markers are noise markers and were each heard in 10% of plural trials. Participants in the typo condition also received a dominant marker 60% of the time, but their noise markers were designed to resemble possible typos that someone would have been likely to commit on a keyboard. For the test portion, participants saw a new plural picture and were asked to type in the sentence that describes it in Octarian. There were 48 of these, with each noun occurring 8 times. So remember, we are hypothesizing here that participants should regularize more in the participant condition, since the instructions told them the input was from another participant and might contain mistakes, and that this should especially be true when the markers looked like typos. But here's what we found. The x-axis shows marker condition, distinct versus typo, and the y-axis shows the proportion of participants' maximum marker on the test, or the marker that they use the most. And the dashed line is the proportion of the dominant marker in the input. Participants in the distinct condition didn't regularize more. There was no main effect of instruction condition, but there was a main effect of marker type in the participant condition. An interaction between marker type and instruction condition suggested that participants regularize more when the markers look like typos, but only when they're in the participant condition. We analyzed entropy of the markers used in the testing phase. So here, closer to 0 means more regular, and we found the same result. Only those who were told the input might contain mistakes and had markers that looked like typos regularized more. So like Perfors, there was greater regularization when participants were told input might be mistakes, the participant condition, and when the markers seemed like typos. But unlike Perfors, regularization was not greater when told the input might be mistakes if the markers were distinct. So it seems they can change their regularization behavior even when they are learning a rule. So next we wanted to know whether they would regularize more if they know a speaker is non-native. In experiment 2, we ran another 61 adults. This time we had 2 instructions conditions, native and non-native, and we used only the distinct plural markers. We did this because we wanted to move away from using typos. If the hypothesis is to be extended to children learning languages, typos obviously won't work. So we wanted to see a shift in regularization behavior based on the subtle linguistic cues that could be present in the input. Here's what the instructions looked like. In the native condition, participants hear this backstory with the instructions. The sentences actually come from a speaker of the language, Mary, who provided the descriptions. Mary has lived in Octaria her whole life. She's been speaking Octarian since she was a baby. This means that Octarian is her native language and she almost never makes mistakes. Most of the time, she says things the right way in Octarian. In the non-native condition, the backstory says, the sentences actually come from a speaker of the language, Mary, who provided the descriptions. Mary just moved to Octaria. She's only been speaking Octarian for 1 month. This means that Octarian is not her native language and she makes lots of mistakes. Sometimes she says things the wrong way in Octarian. Then we asked them to complete a rating test to ensure that participants indeed believed Mary spoke the language very well in the native condition or not well in the non-native condition. And this is a sliding scale from 0 to 100. The rest of the experiment continued just like in experiment 1. So first, let's look at the results from this proficiency rating. So as you can see from the graph, participants who were told the story that Maeve was a native speaker, the ones in red, rate her proficiency extremely high, nearly all at or very close to 100. Those who were told the story that Mary was not a native speaker rated her proficiency as being much lower. So next, let's look at the regularization results. Remember here, our prediction is that participants in the non-native condition should regularize significantly more because they'll be more likely to attribute the variation in the input to speaker mistakes, so using the wrong plural marker in the wrong contexts. If we look at the proportion of production trials where participants use the maximum marker, we can see that there's no difference in the two conditions. They use their max markers exactly the same amount. If we look at the entropy of their responses, which remember can capture making the language more regular beyond just use of a single form, we can also see there's no difference between conditions. Thus, there's no change in regularization behavior when learning from non-native compared to native speakers. Just in case, we also analyzed the regularization by proficiency rating, so not just the categorical variable of speaker instruction condition. Here, we're plotting their max marker use by their proficiency rating. So if participants were more likely to regularize for speakers they believed to be very poor speakers, and more likely to match the variation when they believed the speaker to be very fluent, we might expect the dots to fall along this dashed line, but they don't at all. Some people who rated the speaker very poorly regularized, but some didn't. Others who rated her extremely highly regularized instead of matching. So to conclude, in experiment 1, we found that if participants are told the input might contain mistakes, they regularize more, but only if those markers look like mistakes or typos. If the variation is just distinct markers, they don't regularize more. In experiment 2, we asked whether learners would be more likely to regularize variation if they knew they were learning from a non-native speaker who was likely to say things the wrong way. But just like in experiment 1, simply being told the input might contain mistakes wasn't enough to lead them to change the language, even if they were aware that the speaker was really bad at the language. So does this mean that children learning natural language from non-native speakers don't regularize more by picking up on subtle linguistic cues that indicate their input is noisy? Not necessarily. We think this is still an interesting proposal, and we plan to continue in a couple of specific directions to ask whether this is the case. But we do think learners need more than just the knowledge that mistakes are happening in order to change a language as they're learning it. And we don't think this will wind up being the language equivalent of typos, which might be something like speech errors. One thing we plan to ask is whether learners need an entry point to the underlying rule in order to find the rule among the noise. So in the Perfors study and our work here, the language is perfectly unpredictable, but perhaps non-native speakers get some things right nearly all the time and other things they struggle with. Or they make mistakes on difficult things, but not easier ones. Another thing to ask is whether learners need to observe red flags during learning in order to track that a mistake has occurred, which would allow them to discard or discount that particular instance as they're learning the rule. Some things we've considered so far are speech disfluencies, so saying things like or facial expressions that indicate they're searching for what to say. But we'd love to hear your thoughts, feedback, and suggestions on this. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation, and a special thanks to the Language and Cognition Lab and the Language Evolution Lab at Penn for helpful comments and suggestions. And any questions? Tamar, I think you're muted still.
Thank you, Annalise, for your presentation. And there is a question here from Gwen Lee. It says a clarification question. In experiment 2, were participants subject to type of condition or distinct condition? Since the two conditions showed different patterns of regularization in experiment 1.
We focused on distinct markers since we wanted to really hone in on those that could be markers that or clues that children could use. So typos are really indicating the error. And so we were just trying to focus on the distinct markers and looking at the regularization just based on the reliability of the speaker instead of those other cues.
Thank you, Annalise. We'll wait for more questions to come up. So here is another question. Okay, it's from Sarah. Says, what do you think that participants assume that error is? Do you think it's a mistake in which marker goes with which animal? How would participants be able to figure out what was correct just based on knowing what might be a mistake? And how might that be reflected in generalization?
So in this study, there really was no correct marker based on animal. It was completely random. We typically see that language learners will be likely to condition something based on some property of the input. So gender markers, something of that nature. And we intentionally didn't put that here so that they'd be forced to choose if they thought that there actually were plural markers that they couldn't find a pattern for. And that's what we didn't find. We found that they just probability matched across the board and they didn't regularize to just one. And so if they had seen some kind of a pattern with different animals or something of that nature, this wouldn't have been the case. Katie, did you want to add anything to that?
Okay, thank you. There is another question from Chelsea Sanker. She says, do you think the results would be similar for spoken language, or would there be different effects based on the type of errors expected in each medium or other factors?
That's actually one of the directions we're working on a project now with. So we wanted to start kind of with the type error in terms of speech disfluencies. And we think that they may be more likely to regularize when they have that consistent reminder that the speaker is unreliable with disfluencies in a non-native condition, since there's been previous disfluency studies that show that children in particular are able to pick up that speakers aren't as reliable and that they will change some of their rule learning behavior, or they will change wanting to learn that person's label as opposed to someone else's. And I can't remember the exact study's name, but that really informed our hypothesis in our upcoming study. So short answer, we think that in a spoken condition, it would be similar and they would need something like the typos, since our pilot study without the typos, just telling native versus non-native, didn't show any additional regularization behavior.
Okay, I have no more questions here. We can wait one more minute. Maybe some other questions might pop up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, no more questions. So if anybody would like to contact Annalise Kendrick by email, I think she will not object to this. Thank you very much, Annalise, for your presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go back to the first presenters in our session, Jeremy Steffman from University of California, and Hironori Katsuda from University of California as well. They'd like to elaborate on their presentation, so please go ahead.
Okay, Sorry. Maybe we should start. Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry about this. Just a moment. Yeah, I think maybe we should start from our reaction time results to just refresh your memory of this part. And this is Jeremy's part. So Jeremy, if you're ready, please go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, I'll take just a moment for those of you who talk at the beginning of the session, refresh your memory about our reaction time results, which you see displayed here. I'll then briefly talk about the accuracy results, and then I'll turn it back to Hiro to talk about our interpretation discussion. Takeaways from the reaction time results were that segment and identity primes were different significantly as found by the model, or credibly we could say, while we also have fairly strong evidence for a difference between accent and segment primes, where accent primes in terms of reaction time show more inhibition, with the third finding being no credible difference between control and segment primes, which you see there. Okay, so with that in mind, let's turn to our accuracy analysis. You see it displayed here with the proportion of correct responses given to a word target split by the 4 prime types as before. And generally, we can note qualitatively that primes for which we saw longer reaction times are less accurately responded to. So in our analysis, we find that looking at the 3 rightmost bars, that is ignoring accent for a moment, there's no credible difference between pairwise comparisons of these 3 prime types, though we see, as reflected in the model estimates, some difference, but nothing that approaches what we would consider any strength of evidence or a difference across these 3 types. But if we compare to accent primes, we see a credible difference between accent and segment, where accent primes are responded to less accurately. And comparing accent to identity primes, which should be the most facilitatory, we see another clear difference, which we can compare to the absence of a difference between what we see for both segment and identity primes. So taking that into account in terms of our predictions, we think this further reinforces the kind of suggestion we made on the basis of reaction time data, that is that accent and segment are playing different roles in terms here of the listener's accuracy as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Hiro.
Okay, thank you. So basically, we found the facilitation in the identity prime in terms of reaction time, but we didn't find any facilitation in the segment condition. And we basically replicated Kato and Otake's study by showing that accent is used to restrict word activation in Japanese. And regarding the relative contribution of segment and accent, the results were not as clear as the role of accent, but we found some moderately strong evidence of the difference between segment and accent conditions, such that responses in the segment condition are faster than responses in the accent condition. But since we didn't find any difference between segment and control conditions, the difference between segment and accent conditions is due to the inhibition in the accent condition. And this is consistent with the accuracy data too. And now, why inhibition in the accent condition occurs? And we employ a group activation hypothesis proposed by Post et al. In the context of Mandarin tone. And according to this hypothesis, tone evokes lexical items with the same tone. And based on our results, we argued that pitch accent likewise evokes lexical items with the same pitch accent profile. And competition among those lexical items results in the inhibitory effect observed in the accent condition. Of course, there are a lot of remaining questions that we couldn't answer in this experiment. And before concluding our talk, I want to just briefly mention those further directions. First, we'd like to conduct experiment with varying degrees and locations of segmental overlap, as these studies cited here conducted. And I won't explain them in detail, but I have shown some possibilities, like possible contrast here. And if you have any questions, you can ask us in the question and answer period. And second, now that we confirmed the role of pitch accent, distinguishing finally accented words and unaccented words by using frame sentence, now we can investigate the role of phrasal prosody, such as the effect of final accent neutralization on processing. And again, I will skip these examples, but basically we believe that this kind of experiment can identify how word final accent is represented, or for example, what's the difference between word final accent and unaccented words, how they are represented in the lexicon. Okay, so takeaways of this study is first, we replicated Catalan de Otake's study by showing accent is used to restrict word activation. And we also found that accent and segment have different roles in word recognition, providing more empirical support for the group activation hypothesis. And we believe that our findings contribute to a better understanding of the role of suprasegmental properties in spoken word recognition and build a foundation for follow-up studies. Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so you finished. In fact, there is somebody. Okay, in the first part of the session there was Guan Li, and he wants to elaborate on the answers that you give in the beginning of the session.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And he wants to contact you, like contact you directly.
Yeah, after.
Just let me, yeah, because he wants to clarify more.
Sure, yeah. Sorry about
yes,
that.
okay. So I'm trying to go on Lee. I can't find him here. I'm not sure where is he. Okay, let me contact him. Send him a message.
I think I can say right now. Do you hear me?
Okay, here he is.
Yeah, so I can directly address to the one of the presenters of the study. So thank you for your presentation. And my concern was, as you saw, like I think there can be some semantic priming also going on in the same situation. So I personally done some priming studies, and I found out that priming is really subtle, and they like listeners can think of some possible like symmetry relatedness, and that might confound your results. So do you think you can entertain by using the target as nonce word and like the prime word as nonce word, and that is probably have same pitch tones but have no meaning? In that case, you can tease apart the effect of suprasegmental similarity from possible symmetry relatedness.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really interesting point. And but I feel like, however, if we want to use nonce words as primes, we first have to establish that if there is any processing difference between processing nonce words and processing real words. And also another concern is even if we use nonce words, that can activate some like neighborhood, like phonologically similar words.
Right.
And, yeah, but I think that idea is really interesting. And yeah, maybe first we need to establish how, like, what's the difference between processing nonce words and real words. And that's also a very interesting follow-up study, I think. Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, fine. Okay, there is another question, and it could be for Jeremy and it could be for Hironori, because I asked, it's from Ryan Lay, and he said any one of you can answer the question. He says, you find a difference in the roles of segmental and suprasegmental information. What would you expect to see in languages where certain phonological categories correspond to cues that include both suprasegmental and segmental information? That's we say voicing, phonation, etc. Did you get the question? Yes?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Jeremy, do you have any?
Yeah, I have some. That's a really interesting question. First, I think, because it raises for me the kind of question of how we distinguish both in terms of what we measure and how they impact processing segment from suprasegment. Since of course every segment has a duration. If it's sonorous, it'll have a pitch, etc. So I think the two questions are: one could say, are the effects that we see, differences in processing, are they attributable to acoustic medium like F0? Or conversely, are they attributable to the functional load that a given cue or set of cues holds in a certain language? So I don't have any. My thought in general is that a piece of information, regardless how it's cued, whatever the acoustic properties are, will be differentially useful in terms of its functional load. So that would entail looking at kind of how much weight it's pulling with the contrast system of the language. And that's kind of, at least given our results, I think where I fall on this, where I think it's related to the load of a given cue and kind of independent of the acoustic medium per se, like phonation or duration or pitch. But Hiro, maybe you want to add something to that?
No, thank you. Yeah, I mean.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy, for your answer. I hope that is already satisfying for Ryan. I have no more questions. We will wait for more questions to come up, either in the chat box or in the Q&A. So also, if you can still jot down your questions in the chat box as well. Please tell us to whom you are addressing the questions. Okay, Jeremy and Hironori, you can still elaborate on your points if you like. We have time. So if you would like to do that, so you're more than welcome until we get more questions for you.
I'm not sure what's the best way. I mean,
because here I'm checking if there are any questions either in the chat box or Q&A. I don't see until now, so we will wait. So that's why until another question would pop up, you may elaborate on your points on your slides, for example.
You could show, perhaps this might prompt questions.
Yes, please. Please go ahead. Share with us, yes, more.
By the setting, if you want to screen share.
okay, yeah.
This is kind of a study in different collecting data during COVID that was online. And we were interested.
Okay, thank you.
Though we didn't, we analyzed these results as a group data. What we found, this is comparing reaction time and accuracy by the setting. So in person at left and remote, that was over the internet at right. A difference in reaction times, that is long reaction times for remote data collection, but no difference in accuracy, which is perhaps kind of reassuring. The reaction time difference, to me, it's not clear if that's coming from, of course, the actual mechanism of collecting reaction times is different. That is, it's a button box in one case and key press in the other case, which is time synced and supposed to be very accurate according to the platform we used, but just the mechanistically pressing a key might take longer, or participants might be less engaged sitting at home in front of their laptop or wherever they are. So I think kind of an interesting comparison there, but fortunately no difference in accuracy across the settings in which we collected the data. And I don't know if another point of interest might be how participants responded to each prime type. I don't know if you want to show that here across the platforms. There's essentially the same pattern, but much more pronounced in person. So I think my takeaway with this is the remote data collection is noisy. And you know, as far as collecting like a kind of online measure like reaction time, you'd want to indeed collect a lot of participants for this sort of study. And we are collecting, as actually data collection is ongoing as we speak. We're hoping to fill out our count a little bit. So that's one thing we could take questions.
So I think we have already explained everything. So
I'm waiting for any questions. Still, you have time.
Yeah.
Still, you have time. Yes. So that if you'd like to give us more, that would be great as well. Because I don't have questions either in the QA or in the chat box. So you can, that's why you can still elaborate on that. That would be great as well.
Okay.
I can't think of anything else in particular else that I have to say about our study.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, what about if somebody else would be interested in presenting any materials for us among the panelists? Would anybody be interested in presenting anything for us? No? No questions. Is anybody interested in asking Annalise any questions? That was the presentation before Jeremy and Hironori. Okay, there is a question. Okay, it's just a compliment. It's from Guan. Guan, he says, thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so since there will be no more questions, so we can end the session. And if anybody interested in getting more information about the materials presented by any of the presenters today, you can still contact them by email. Thank you very much for your attendance and have a nice day. Bye for now.